In this video, we're going to continue talking about Redux, and we're going to transition over from working on this example, the increment and decrement example, to working on the Redux store we'll be using for the Expensify application. So we're going to focus on getting an array of expenses as well as various filters to filter or sort the data. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is this function right here. We've used this function quite a bit and we know kind of how it works, but I haven't given you a strict definition for what it is and the properties that it has. So what we're going to do is focus on this function. This function is called a reducer. So if we head back over to the Redux documentation, it's actually one of the core concepts. So right under here, we have basics and we have stuff we've looked at. We've already seen actions. We've already created a store. We've looked at some data flow, and we'll look at the usage with React a little bit later. What we need to talk about right now is this guy right here. Now, you actually know a whole lot about reducers. You just haven't associated them with this term. So what is a reducer? Actions describe the fact that something happened, but they don't specify how the application state changes in response. This is the job of the reducer. And we've already seen this definition in practice. Over here, we get our action, but the action alone doesn't actually do anything. It's the reducer that determines what to do based off of an action. How do we want to change the state? So in order to better visualize this, we can actually create the reducer up above and pass it in. Right here, I will create a section for my reducers. I can create a const, and we're going to go ahead and call this one count reducer. And we are going to set it equal to, right here, I'm just going to copy and paste the function. I'm going to take the function from up above, cut it out, pasting it right here, and then down below, I will pass to create store my reducer. So I'm just going to reference the count reducer function we just defined. Now we have the exact same functionality that we had before we started this video, but now we have a separate reducer, and this is something that we're going to use as we go forward because our more real-world applications, like the Expensify app, they're actually going to have multiple reducers. Now we'll talk about that in just a little bit. For now, let's go ahead and outline some of the key attributes of a reducer. The first important attribute is that reducers are pure functions. Now, what is a pure function? It's not just a function. A pure function has certain qualities. First up, the output is only determined by the input. In our case, this function's output, what it returns, it is only determined by the things that get passed in. So the state and the action. It doesn't use anything else from outside of the function scope, and it doesn't change anything outside of the function scope either. So let's take a quick look at an example of a not pure function. Let's say I have a variable, let a equal 10, and then I have a const add, and I go ahead and set up a function that takes b, and I return a plus b. This is not a pure function because the output of this function, what it returns, doesn't just depend on the input. It also depends on this global variable, which could indeed change. Now, we don't want this for our reducers. Our reducers need to compute the new state based off of the old state and the action. Now, aside from using things to find outside of the function, we also don't want to change things outside of the reducer. So let's say I do move a in. Now we have a pure function. This is perfectly fine. The output of add only depends on the input. But what if we go ahead and do something like this? Let result equal, and maybe we actually leave it undefined at first. Then down below, maybe we set result equal to a plus b. So once again, we don't have a pure function because this function is interacting with things outside of its scope. In this case, it is changing a variable. We don't want to change variables outside of the reducer scope. We don't want to rely on values from variables outside of the reducer scope. We just want to use the input, the state, and the action to return the new state value. So that is the first important thing to note. Reducers are pure functions, and we've already met that criteria by just using the state and the action arguments. Next up, number 2, we want to never change state or action. So we are going to get state and action passed into all of our reducers. We don't want to directly change these things. So I don't want to reassign a value to state or action. If they're objects, I don't want to mutate them. Instead, we should just be reading off of both of those things, returning an object that represents the new state. If you do find yourself directly changing state or action, it's best to step back and ask what you're trying to accomplish. In most cases, you are just trying to mutate the state, in which case I recommend just returning it on the new object instead. Mutating the state directly is going to have undesired effects, which is exactly what we saw with this .setState previously in the course. And that's it. We have our reducer, and it follows both of these rules. It is indeed a pure function. We never change state or action, so we are all set. That's where we're going to leave this example for now. We're going to go ahead and continue looking at Redux by creating another file in the Playground folder. We're going to build out a similar Redux store setup for the Expensify application, and those things, those action generators and reducers, will actually be using and connecting to Redux. But step one is to just create an empty file. I'm going to call this one redux-expensify.js, and inside of here, we're going to be adding a little bit of code. First things first, I do want to save the changes to Redux 101, adding those comments in, and over inside of the Webpack config file, I'm going to switch us from running Redux-101 to Redux-expensify. Awesome. Now, all we need to do is restart the server, then we'll be able to build out the Expensify Redux store right here in our file. I'm going to shut down the old server, start up the new one with the new Webpack config file, and if I do head over to the browser and open up localhost 8080, right here in the developer tools, we can see that we have nothing in the console, and that's okay. This is completely expected right now because we have nothing inside of our JavaScript file. Right here, we'll kick things off with an import. We are going to grab something off of Redux we've already used before, create store, and we're also going to grab something else for this project. That is combine reducers. Combine reducers is going to allow us to create multiple functions that define how our Redux application changes. One reducer was fine for this example because we weren't tracking a whole lot of data. We're really just tracking a single number. As we create more complex Redux stores, we're going to have more complex data, and having a single reducer is going to create a really long complex function. So instead, we're going to be learning how we can use combine reducers to create multiple smaller functions and combine them together. Now we're going to grab all of this from Redux. Down below, the first thing I would like to do is go ahead and take a look at the final state. So what are we trying to build? Right here, I'm going to create a const demo state, and this is just going to be a static object that represents the various things we're going to want to keep track of, and this is going to be way more complex than the previous one where we had count set equal to a number. We're going to kick things off by having an expenses array. So expenses is going to be an array. If there are no items in the array, there are no expenses to list. As we add expenses though, we're going to add objects into this array. I'm using objects because there are multiple things I want to track for each expense, starting with the ID. This is going to get randomly generated for us later. For now, we can just use a random string of characters. Down below the ID, we're going to have a description for the expense. This is going to be something short and sweet like January rent. After description, we're going to have an optional note field. So note can be something a little more long-winded. This was the final payment for that address. Maybe I'm moving out and I want to make a special note of it in my expenses dashboard. After note, we're going to have the actual amount you paid. So amount is going to be the total amount paid, and I'm going to be using US dollars, and we'll be sticking with the currency in pennies. So instead of 545.00, if that's my rent, I'm going to remove the decimal. So this would be $545 represented in pennies, which is 54,500. Sticking with cents reduces any sort of rounding errors or computational errors that require you to get rid of extra decimal points. So by sticking with pennies, we don't have to worry about any of that. After amount, what am I going to have right here? We are going to have the final thing we need for an expense when it was created at. So we're going to track this value as a timestamp, and we'll learn more about that later. But for now, all we're going to do is just set it up to be the number 0. We'll look at exactly how we can track and change time as well as formatting time for displaying it to the user all a bit later. So this is going to be the expenses array, and we're going to have multiple expenses for our application, so we'll have multiple objects on this array. Aside from tracking expenses, adding them, removing them, and editing them, we're also going to be tracking various filters that we want the users to be able to apply. Maybe I want to sort my data by date. Maybe I want to sort it by the amount. Maybe I want to filter my expenses by a date range or search for them by a text value. To allow all of that, we're going to be tracking something else on the Redux store as well. This will be filters, and filters is going to be an object. On this object, we're just going to store the current value for a few filters. The first thing we're going to allow users to do is just enter a random string. So we can take a string like rent, and we can search the description in Note for all expenses, finding just the matches. So we're going to allow them to filter by text. We're also going to allow them to pick how they want to sort the expenses they're viewing when they're on the dashboard page. So we're going to keep track of a sort by field. This value could be something like date, or we could have it be amount. So I'm going to right here add a little comment, date or amount, to let us know that this value can indeed change to one of those two things. Now we have sort by in place. We also have text in place. The next two things we're going to track are related to filtering by a date range. So we're going to have a start date. I'll call this start date. And I'm going to start it off at undefined. And right here down below, we'll have end date. And we'll start this off at undefined for the demo data as well. As a user does pick the various dates though, these values are going to change, and we're only going to show expenses whose created at property is between the two picked. So all of this is going to be the data that we need to track in order to create a real world expense tracking application. Now that we have the dummy data in place, let's continue on to the next video where you're going to learn how to use combine reducers, and that's going to allow us to actually write reducers for this complex state. I'm very excited to get to that. Let's take a quick moment to recap what we did. In this video, aside from setting up the demo state for the actual Expensify app, we also learned more about the reducer, which is that function we passed in to create store. We learned that they need to be pure functions and that the reducer code cannot change the state or action. Instead, it should just be reading off of these two arguments. In the end of the day, it returns the new state, and that is how it manipulates the Redux store's state. That is it for this one. I will see you in the next video.